Peace and welcome to my channel. Zinyeza here. Tonight I want to talk about self-deification and magical theurgy. Looking into God as opposed to looking up to God. Now, this ancient art and science of self-deification meaning you as man becoming a deity, becoming a divine being, or actualizing your inherent divinity and being that. This is known as self-deification. Anciently, this came under a practice and science called theurgy. Theurgy is a Greek word, and it means the action and process of invoking gods in efforts to become one with them, ultimately for the purpose of what is called Henosis, which is the attainment of oneness of consciousness. So when we deal with theurgy and looking into God versus looking up to God, in magical practice, you typically have two types of practitioners. The one, which is the typical, usual, and common practitioner, is the human person. The person who sees themselves as a terrestrial being, i.e. a physical being attempting to have a spiritual experience, and therefore their perspective with regards to deities and other invisible forces is that of them as in the practitioner being secondary and being lesser in power, ability, and rank to these particular beings, forces, entities, etc. And this is the person who typically is praying to these energies, asking, petitioning, looking up to them, seeing them as outside of themselves, and hoping through their continual devotion to receive blessings or graces in the form of it all depends on what type of practitioner this particular person is, because not everyone who practices magic is into spiritual attainment. Some who practice magic are only interested in what they can acquire materially or socially, meaning they might only be concerned with acquiring finance, more clientele for their business, and socially they might only be concerned with attracting a partner, friends, damaging a supposed enemy, things of this nature. They might not at all be concerned with transforming their emotions from a reactionary state to an action based upon intelligence, calmness, and wisdom. So you have that dynamic to factor in it too. But this is the typical human person who does not recognize themselves as inherently divine. Then you have the other type of practitioner who sees themselves, knows themselves, and is confident that they are a spiritual being having a human experience. And therefore, this particular practitioner's perspective towards the deities is that these are individualized expressions of a singular force in existence, which doesn't necessarily need to be defined, but let's just say its source. And it manifests itself as attributes, which are then in mythologies, theologies, and other forms of organized tales dealing with divine beings, from that particular point, it comes into a form of describing divinity in a manner in which man can contemplate. Because when you deal with gods, usually in mythology, they have a form of some sort. In fact, it seems that only when you get to the Christian or the monotheistic religions that God ceases to be actually man. Because Jehovah, there's no official paintings or documentations of what that particular entity looks like. The same with Metatron and Allah. There's no depictions of these particular entities, although if you have the symbolical understanding as to what they are, it's easy to find the correspondences to what those particular deities are. Now, so to simplify what I was just saying, this particular magician knows that inherently they are God. If inherently, by right of having a soul, you are divine, because the soul is the only aspect of you that does not die as the body does, then obviously this is a evidence of essential divinity, and therefore you through the medium of the mind, the work of this particular practitioner is to assume the characteristics of whatever particular deity being worked with, and efforts of the attributes associated with that deity being absorbed into the consciousness of the practitioner for the purpose of attaining spiritual advancement and ultimately obtaining spiritual enlightenment, which is called Henosis, the attainment of oneness. That oneness which is Kether on the tree of life, that oneness which is Sahasrara, or the crown in the chakra system, that oneness which is yin and yang, that oneness which is the serpent biting the tail. It's all the same concept. It's all the uniting of the macrocosm with the microcosm. It's all the transcending of duality and the becoming one. So that is the explanation of theurgy or self-deification. It's rather simple. The only thing that prevents anyone from making the efforts to achieve these goals is mentality. And what is the blocks to mentality but holding on to belief systems based upon trauma? And it's really just trauma and mind control, or you can just call it conditioning. And yeah, so if one is not willing to look at themselves and analyze their own psyche and as to determine what in their mind is really just a result of a social engineered ploy to get them to conform with the collective belief system of self-limitation. If one cannot look at themselves like that, then of course they won't find themselves in a mentality where they are seeing themselves as divine. But if someone is one of those practitioners that's desiring to have the full picture, have a holistic understanding, not a biased perspective, then they'll take those trips, and they'll be willing to break down barriers of their thoughts, and potentially even have their ego transformed from one belief system to a state of knowing, to a knowing system, and therefore make themselves capable of deifying their consciousness. So that is the explanation of theurgy, self-deification, and henosis. Thank you for listening. Peace.